job and previous jobs to visit the Arctic and Antarctic. And those harsh conditions that are there are something that we shouldn't take lightly from a warfighting perspective, as well as just from a security perspective. And so when I look at those challenges and difficulties, I do think it's important that we look at this from the broader context of the security environment that we're faced with today. And also from the lens of Northcom and NORAD, we look at it from the lens of defending North America. And that security environment certainly has changed. And I think in the Arctic, it's as highlighted as much as it is anywhere else, and really the Arctic becomes our first line of defense for North America. And that's important in a time when North America is no longer a sanctuary. We used to look at the Arctic as a buffer zone and our oceans as buffer zones, and now they're avenues of approach. And so I think we need to keep that in mind as we do look at the changing dynamic that's happening in the Arctic. And certainly over the last 2 decades, even outside the Arctic, our potential adversaries have certainly watched our global operations. They've watched how we've been able to be fairly successful bringing the fight to other folks. And now they're looking to see what are the things they can do, both from a strategy standpoint as well as from a capability and capacity standpoint, to bring the fight to us at home in North America. And that's where the Arctic and the avenue of approach through the Arctic becomes a key player. And so from the lens that we're looking at it, it is indeed something that we need to focus on. As we look at our adversary, who's not only have shown the capability and capacity with the investment, that investment is paying off now with the actual capability and capacity, and now we are actually seeing some intent. And we do that from the patterns of behavior that we're seeing from both, say, for example, Russia and China. And so when we look at Russia, for example, we see the country with clearly the largest Arctic footprint. In some ways that makes sense based on their GDP, and much of it based on the Arctic. But we also see the building of bases and capabilities in there to include long-range missile capabilities. We see cruise missile capability. We see them looking to defend and ultimately control large stretches of the northern sea route. Then we look at China, as articulated in the recently released OSD annual report to Congress. They've greatly increased their activities and engagements in the Arctic to include a development of a polar Silk Road. And while not an Arctic nation, China's declared itself a near Arctic state. And I'm not sure that's even a defined term. And today, as we sit here today, our Secretary of State is actually over with the other Arctic nations in Finland, and I look forward to hearing the outcome of those sessions from Secretary Pompeo. And clearly, other Arctic nations have raised concerns about some of our other players in the Arctic, to include Russia and China. And it's not just, of course, from a defense standpoint that we're concerned about the Arctic, but clearly the increasing traffic, human activity, and potential conflict over the resources is something that keep us focused in here. And our Coast Guard counterparts will talk about many of the efforts that we're doing, but ultimately to be a credible Arctic player, we have to have the ability to operate in and through the extreme cold and isolating nature of that landscape. And so as we look at the future, we have to look at, well, how do we develop that capability? How do we make sure that we don't acquiesce that space because we don't have the ability to operate in there? And so we, from Northcom, we actually run our Arctic Capabilities Working Group, and we represent all the COCOMs in there to try to drive what are the capabilities and capacity we need to be able to operate in there. And recently, we've reinvigorated that. I've actually taken the chair of that over myself personally in order to bring that to a higher level and bring it not only with us at Northcom, but tie in with EUCOM, with Indo-PACOM, with STRATCOM and TRANSCOM, the major players as COCOMs that all have a play in the Arctic. And of course, we have our U.S. and Canadian partnership in NORAD, and that's also very concerned with respect to the Arctic. And as we sit here today, I actually have some of my U.S. and Canadian general officers in the Arctic looking at the landscape to personally understand what are the things we need to do. And some of those things include improving our communications, improving our domain awareness, and some of the work that the services are doing to include, for example, development in satellite communication using the MUOS, or Multi-User Objective System, to make sure we have that ability to communicate in the Arctic, which is not an easy endeavor at all. And we, in U.S. Northcom and NORAD, we have to be able to understand the domain and things happening within that domain. And so looking at the domain awareness, we're looking at things like our North Warning System and things that we need to do with the North Warning System. And then it's important that we can operate in that environment, and we have to, in order to do that, we have to exercise. I think on those who haven't spent much time up there, you say, well, what can be so different about operating in the Arctic? And I can tell you it's completely different operating in the Arctic. And if we're not doing it, we're not training, we're not exercising, we're not practicing, then we will not be able to operate in that environment when asked to do so. So we're increasing things, for example, the Jay Park Range in Alaska. We're increasing the participation of the services. I've personally had discussions with the CNO, the Commandant, both the Commandant of the Marine Corps, Commandant of the Coast Guard, to increase our training within Arctic Edge, as an example, sponsored by U.S. Northcom, and a training venue that gets our team focused in the Arctic. And of course, our Coast Guard is a close partner. We're one of the biggest advocates to replace the Polar Star with the icebreaker and the Polar Security Cutter that we know is so incredibly important to us as a nation. And so we look forward to that actually coming to fruition, and we're very excited that the funding is now in place. And of course, our U.S. Navy, they have never left the Arctic, especially with respect to the undersea and the great work that they do on the submarine force. But we also have to look from the surface force. What are the things we can do to make sure we can operate there with our surface fleet? And I'd highlight the work of the Harry S. Truman over the last year, spending 44 days in the North Atlantic, North Sea, and Norwegian seas. And there were many lessons learned from that. And those lessons learned are being taken by the service and taken to understand what are the things that we need to adjust so that we can continue and have that ability to operate within the Arctic. So I applaud CNO and his team for the work that they're doing there. And then as we look forward, we need to make sure that we ultimately have the ability to operate in this security environment that we're in. We don't want conflict. We're not looking for conflict in the Arctic. But nonetheless, we must be prepared. We must be prepared to operate in that battle space. And as we do so, we have to look both medium-term, short-term, and of course, long-term. And we can't be captured by a paralysis by analysis trap where we're just thinking about what is it we need to do. There are things we can get after now, and I'm happy to report that as we look at what the services are doing, they clearly are looking to actually take action now so we can increase our ability to operate. Because to me, it's both urgent and important, and it's something we need to take on. It's something that we need to be able to do to be able to operate within that environment, and it's not going to happen without focused attention to it. And over the last couple of years, that increased focus, in my opinion, is very warranted. Thank you.
Thank you, General. Let me introduce Commissioner Jeff Hutchinson. Commissioner Hutchinson's a graduate of University of Western Ontario Law School. He previously served as Deputy Commissioner for Strategy and Shipbuilding and had 2 Director General positions in National Strategy and Integrated Business Management. He has 15 years of executive experience in public service, a high-time lawyer, and he has a great sense of humor. Commissioner Hutchinson.
Thanks, Mike. So it's not a long flight from Ottawa to DC, but it's just long enough for me to have gone over a speech that I'm not going to give. So whoever is running AV at the back, you can skip my slides. I'm just going to speak extemporaneously, and unfortunately for all of you, it means you have to listen because there won't be anything to look at. A couple of preliminary comments. First, I'll tell you, having been on this panel for 3 years now, 2 years ago, when we had the panel, the panelists outnumbered the audience. And this year, this room is even far more full than it was last year. And for you folks standing, there are a few seats at this end, and I strongly encourage you to make your way down. You won't distract us, and you may want to be more comfortable. A couple other preliminary comments. I really want to genuinely congratulate the U.S. Coast Guard on their Arctic strategic outlook. Admiral Abel, I'll try not to use too many of the words from it because I know you'll want to speak to it. But it won't surprise anybody in the room that the Canadian Coast Guard and the U.S. Coast Guard have some similar views. So if you notice that, that's quite natural. I also want to congratulate the U.S. Coast Guard on the announcement of the Polar Security Cutter. I'll get right behind General O'Shaughnessy as an advocate and a fan for the U.S. Coast Guard to have that capability. We absolutely need more surface capability, both on the Canadian side and the American side. So we're thrilled to see that that budget approved. And finally, I want to congratulate the U.S. Coast Guard on something you may not be expecting, and that is the published a recent study on the retention of women in the Coast Guard. Just as a quick aside, this is the year at IMO of women in maritime industries. The Commandant spoke this morning. He made reference to the need for greater diversity and inclusion. We would say in the Coast Guard, you might say in all uniform services, but we're really glad that that important piece of work has moved forward and been released, and we're taking as many lessons from it as we can. So strategies for the frozen domain, and Mike has already referred to the fact that it's maybe not as froze as it once was, but from where we sit, there's still lots of ice. So let's not get too ahead of ourselves in terms of what the Arctic looks like. A couple of years ago, we were talking about the Crystal Serenity going through the Northwest Passage and the risks that that represented, and it was an opportunity, of course, for our service and the American service to work very, very closely together to prepare for a new set of challenges, a new set of risks. Last year, nobody transited the Northwest Passage. It was still ice-filled. It's a very difficult place to navigate. So we'll look cautiously to the future, I would say, in terms of the ice that's there. We, of course, believe in climate change. I suppose we could debate the causes of it. We do see the changes in the ice, obviously, but we always start by sounding a note of caution, because people who live a great distance from the Arctic, and what are we, 38 and a half degrees north here, we see people trying to take fiberglass boats and things like that, and yeah, the reinforced fiberglass is still really not, you get my point. So 3 strategies I want to talk about. One, I was hoping I could come up with a better word than domestic, but I never got beyond it, so pardon me for that. But the Canadian Coast Guard is quite focused on our domestic relationships. And you can say, well, duh. But let me just expand on that for a second, because I think we're doing something that's a little bit unique, and I'd like to share it with you. We've just created a new region in the Arctic, which I think would roughly align to what the American Coast Guard calls a district. We had formerly managed our Arctic operations out of Montreal, and we did that because the icebreaking fleet that we use in the Arctic is the same icebreaking fleet that we use in the south during the winter, so southern icebreaking in the winter, northern icebreaking in the summer. So now we've created a new region, new district, without its own fleet, and you might think that that sounds ridiculous, but the whole purpose of our Arctic region is to completely reinvent the relationships that we have with people who live in the Arctic, with Northerners. As we were building this concept, I was talking to a Canadian Inuit leader, and she asked me, she said, so how much infrastructure investment are you going to make through the new region? I said, I don't know. And she said, how many people you have? And I said, I don't know. And she said, so you want to come to the Arctic, but you don't have a plan? And I said, we don't have a plan because you and I haven't sat down together yet to write it. And that, I think, captures the intention of what we're doing in our new Arctic region. We are trying to stop the old practice of projecting ideas out of Ottawa into the Arctic, solving problems for people as if they needed our help. And we're trying to take an approach that establishes Arctic priorities based on, oh, wait a second, Arctic priorities. So we're sitting with the people who live there, and we're looking at what the world looks like through their eyes, and creating priorities and investments and a way forward that's based on a shared vision rather than a southern vision projected north. I'll tell you, just to wrap up that point, that northern communities, which can be very remote, as you know, we have many communities in our Arctic that are only accessible by air most of the year. It's been quite interesting to me that the very first question I've been asked by some of those communities as we've engaged in the conversation is, what about national security? And instinctively, it's not what I expected them to ask me about, and yet I think it underscores some of the points that General O'Shaughnessy made. It underscores the reason why there are so many people in this room right now. The priorities in the Arctic are shifting, the view of the Arctic is shifting, and that's true for the people that live there as much as it's true for us. Secondly, I'd like to touch quickly on a strategy of partnership. As a civilian operator, you'll hear me use consistent language from year to year. We talk about stewardship in the Arctic as a primary focus. We talk about cooperation. We think the situation in the Arctic is evolving quickly enough that we've reached a point where I might ask you to try and hold two thoughts in your head at the same time. One is, yes, we are seeing great power competition, and I'm sure Admiral Abel will touch on that. But at the same time, we still advocate an area of high attention, low tension, and cooperation. There is lots of cooperation already happening, and I'd be remiss if I didn't underscore the very important work of the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, for example. This is a place where, not to overstate it, but it's a place where members of your Arctic Coast Guards can sit down and have conversations amongst themselves with representatives from other countries where conversations have become more difficult in other spheres. And we can talk about the need for cooperation, particularly in areas of civilian response, search and rescue, and environmental response. We all continue to recognize that the vastness of the Arctic, both the ice, the sea, and the land, requires us to continue to work together, and we will and we are. There isn't an Arctic nation that hasn't relied on another Arctic nation for support at some point. And I say that with both pride and humility. Canada has certainly relied on our American friends, our Danish friends, our Russian friends at different times in our history in the Arctic, and that will continue to be the case. We learn from each other, we exercise together, but at the end of the day, we really rely on each other too. The third, well, maybe just before I move off that point, I'll pick up on the language about near Arctic states and new Arctic states and Arctic states, or states with a new interest in the Arctic. There is a call for humility that is required when we talk about the Arctic. The Arctic is a fragile environment. It is a difficult operating environment, as we've already heard described. It is completely different in some ways. And I was asked the other day, what's the single greatest threat in the Arctic? And the person was expecting me to say, because they know my mind on these things, that climate change is our biggest change. It's not. Hubris is our biggest threat in the Arctic. And we have to approach it with humility. We have to approach it with respect. And I think that that's the ethos of the Arctic Coast Guard Forum and the partners that are there. And I'd strongly advocate to all services that need to operate there that be part of the thinking. Finally, I want to lend my voice to the support of the rules-based international order as a strategy in the Arctic. What is the rules-based international order? Does it exist? Do we need to create one? The answer to that is yes, it exists. And we can continue to strengthen it. We can continue to clarify it. Anybody in the room that's from a common law jurisdiction, we continue to evolve our law through jurisprudence and through legislation. Those two tools work together. What have we got in the Arctic? Well, we've got UNCLOS. If you're not a member, you should be.
Thank you.
And I love seeing that every time the U.S. Coast Guard says it, because it's true. We've got a framework, let's use it. We've got customary law, and it's recognized, it's old, and it stands. We have jurisprudence in the Arctic, and we should continue to use that and continue to evolve it. And I took note when the Commandant in the previous session made reference to work that the U.S. Coast Guard was doing with respect to the UN Security Council. There is a framework, and we should continue to support it. We should also recognize, I think, that the rules-based international order does need to evolve as more and more states develop their own voice in advocating for how they would like that order to evolve. I think we should be open to that. But that said, there is a framework, there is a set of rules, and if we're going to keep the Arctic a place of high attention and low tension, then the rules-based international order has to be the framework that allows us to do that. So I'm going to end with two quick thoughts. One is that from time to time I get the sense that people are looking for cracks in the Arctic relationships. And I'd just like to take a second and underscore that cooperation is high in the Arctic, and we need to continue to support that. And we need to continue to look for the opportunities to support that. Yes, there may be cracks, there may be points of tension, but they have to be offset by what I might suggest we coin as great power cooperation. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, sir. Even great without the slides. Next up is Vice Admiral Dan Abel. Dan is a 1983 High Honors graduate of the Coast Guard Academy. He was Director of Ops at the U.S. Southern Command and had two commands, command of the 1st Coast Guard District in Boston, as well as command of the 17th Coast Guard District in Juneau, Alaska. So he has firsthand experience on Arctic affairs. He's also a reputable pilot and tells stories with his hands. Admiral.
Well, thanks, Mark, I think. Well, first of all, thanks for being here. Thanks for your interest in the Arctic, and particularly, I guess, what the U.S. Coast Guard has to say about it. Mike mentioned that I was doing my time in the 1st District. That's New Jersey. That goes all the way to Canada. The hustle and bustle of the Northeast. And when the Vice Commandant called and said, I'd like to give another district. And I said, which one? And he said, are you arguing? And I said, no, I'm not arguing, because if you're an admiral, anything that's not in the Beltway is a good deal. And he said, I'd like to send you up to Juneau to take command of the 17th Coast Guard District. And I mentioned to him that I had never served in Alaska. And he said, are you arguing? I said, no, sir, I'm not arguing. I said, can I talk to my wife? He said, that's a good response. You got 24 hours. So the wife said, yeah, this sounds like a good idea, and we did it. What I want to share is my first experience, because I think it also highlights what Jeff was saying as far as listening to those that are impacted by the Arctic. So I flew out to Juneau, and I expected 3 days with my relief, where you go over paperwork and pending personnel issues and things like that. He said, no, we're getting on a C-130 tomorrow, and we're flying up to Barrow. Okay. They put on more foul weather gear than I've ever seen in my life. I got on a snow machine, and off we went 5 miles out onto the Arctic Ocean with an Alaskan whaling captain. And he taught me how to read the ice that was strong enough to drive over or stand on, the ice that was more like Arctic, you just sink right through it. And that's important to know. He said, you can tell from the clouds over here, the ice is starting to melt, because you get these clouds that come as the water evaporates, and that's where the whales will be coming up soon. And I realized this is an interesting, fantastic place that you need to listen to those that have lived there. Because he taught me what his father had taught him and what his father had taught him and what they've been doing for generations. What was the same and what was different. And that's what reinforced to me, too, that this is a changing place with folks that are impacted. Pristine environment, that's for sure, but it's also a changing environment that's likewise harsh. America's Arctic coast, which is also known as Alaska, is more than 6,600 miles. That's more than the entire lower 48 if you added up the coastline there. It's a huge area of responsibility for the Coast Guard. And occasionally I get asked, is the Coast Guard choosing to operate in the Arctic this summer? Well, the Arctic is part of the United States. Alaska is part of the United States. And nobody ever asked me if we're choosing to operate off North Carolina, Florida, or California. These are Americans. We are an Arctic nation, and we need to be in the Arctic. And of course, we're going to operate up there. We work closely with our 2 international partners, our neighbors, certainly our Canadian friends, best neighbors we could ever have. And you look the other way across, we have Russians. And just a little bit of, when you mentioned the fact you've got to cooperate, the distance across the Bering is 44 miles. Basically, think Baltimore to Washington, D.C. That is as close as the United States is to Russia. Clearly, you have to cooperate. Things go into the water, the ice that shouldn't be there, humans or oil. Things get extracted, you have to cooperate there. So like Jeff said, you have to cooperate with your neighbors. Yes, there's competition, but there is great cooperation as well. And the secret is, how do we apply our unique Coast Guard capabilities, limited capacities, our authorities, because we are an interesting duck that is a regulator, a law enforcer, a military, and we can use those in many ways. And finally, how do we use our tentacles back to international maritime organizations to make sure the rules-based and the conduct of operation is what we want for the Arctic? But we're not new to the Arctic. We've been there since 1867, making sure that American sovereignty is there, stressing national security, and promoting economic prosperity. In fact, if you've ever been to the City Council chambers in Nome, Alaska, there's a picture of a Coast Guard cutter pulling in around 1900 to take 30 scallywags out of the village because they kept putting them out in the wilderness and they would come back and continue to be scallywags. So we were protecting the city of Nome. I'm going to mention two major milestones. The first that a number of folks have talked about is the Arctic Strategic Outlook. It's going to print. It's available now on Amazon with a pre-release if you want to get it now. The website should be on the screen somewhere. It does a good job of reaffirming our role in this nation's participation in the Arctic and how we will work our authorities and capabilities and strategies. It got accelerated about 4 years. We did one in 2013, but the political, the security, and the actual, the science up there has changed so quickly, it was time to update our strategy with only 4 years on the old one. And it builds on prior things that we've done in the Arctic. Jeff mentioned the Arctic Coast Guard Forum. That's where the Coast Guards talk about the things of common interest. The Polar Code, that was a game changer. This is the first time internationally vessels in the Arctic have to have specific equipment, safety equipment, training. Well, the question is, who's going to enforce that? Who's going to inspect that? And there's a role for the Coast Guard there. And we also were able to implement a polar access route study. These are shipping lanes that go through the Bering to make sure that we harmonize that traffic with subsistence activities, annual migration activities. It was a great collaboration between the Russians and the United States to make sure that all the equities were well protected. So the Arctic strategy builds on 3 lines of effort. The first is enhance our capability to operate up there. It's a harsh environment. We need different tools and different ways to operate up there. Advanced rule-based order, as Jeff mentioned, the fact that we all live by internationally agreed to conventions, and then adapt and innovate, which is candidly what the Alaska Natives are doing up there. They're adapting and they're innovating. The second major milestone that Jeff talked about, and as did General Shaughnessy, was the fact on April 23rd, the Coast Guard and the Navy, we have a joint project office, awarded the contract for our first polar security cutter. It's the first time our nation has built an icebreaker in over 40 years. Little less than $750 million is awarded to VT Halter, and that will build the first ship and some long lead time materials for the second ship. Options for 2 more to follow, just a hair under $2 billion if all those options are exercised. It stood on 5 individual industry studies before that to make sure we got the contract right and we're getting the design right. There's no question that the Coast Guard needs 6 vessels that can operate in the Arctic. At least 3 of those must be large polar security cutters, and we need one of them as soon as possible to relieve the Polar Star that's doing a fine job, but she needs to be replaced. So to finish off, the Coast Guard has been in the Arctic since 1867. It's not new to us. Our revenue cutters held court on our decks. We saved lives, and we actually brought caribou to villages that had a bad hunt. We were the United States in the Arctic. We are the United States in the Arctic. And we continue to protect U.S. interest, drive down conflict, drive down risk where we can. And while it's a different environment for the Coast Guard, some things remain the same wherever we operate. We protect man from the sea, we protect the sea from man, and we deny the sea those that would do our nation harm. We deliver Semper Paratus at the high latitudes. Thank you.
And last but not least, Rear Admiral John Ocon is a 1991 graduate of State University of New York Maritime College at Fort Schuyler. He holds master's degrees in meteorology, physical oceanography, national security studies. He served 2 tours at sea and commanded the Naval Oceanography Anti-Submarine Warfare Center in Yokosuka, Japan, as well as the Fleet Numerical Meteorology and Oceanography Center in Monterey, California. He's a repeat offender on this panel. Thanks for being here, sir.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for that kind introduction. And please bear with me. It was a late night last night. Who would ever think the Navy's meteorologist and oceanographer would be affected by weather? So a little bit late arrival last night, a little bit of sleep, but happy to be here, and not a daunting task for a one-star to follow these 3 fine gentlemen. But let me take us in a different direction in the conversation. And what I'm going to talk about underpins everything that we've talked about so far this morning, right? If you want to operate in the Arctic, you need to know more truth, right? It starts with us. It starts with the operational analysis and prediction. You want to send Coast Guard cutters. You want to send the Canadian Coast Guard up to the high north. Like the whaling captain said, you better understand the environment that you're operating in. So let me start with a quote. I think it's incredibly appropriate when we think about observations, analysis, and prediction in the Arctic. And it goes like this: the sea is selective, slow at recognition of effort and aptitude, but fast in sinking the unfit. I'll say it again. The sea is selective, slow in recognition of effort and aptitude, but fast in sinking the unfit. Felix Reisenberg said that in the early 1900s, and while I don't think Felix had the Arctic in mind in his comment or teaching, I think his quote is extremely appropriate for the Arctic as it continues to open in the decades to come and we focus our eyes on the challenges of the environment. A few months ago, the CNO signed out their strategic outlook for the Arctic, and I want to dive in to a couple aspects of that. The state of the Arctic, scientific assessments that inform the 2014 Arctic Roadmap and the 2019 Navy Strategic Outlook on the Arctic are consistent and indicate the character of Arctic ice continues to change. Composition of sea ice is trending thinner and younger, and sea ice coverage continues to decrease. Though sea ice has declined at a rate of 13% per decade in the summer and 3% per decade in the winter, understanding and predicting interannual variability in regional ice coverage continues to remain challenging. As we prepare for current and future operations that we talked about this morning, understanding and predicting the environment is critical for meeting mission and ensuring safety of Navy Joint Coalition personnel and equipment. Challenges posed by the harsh Arctic conditions are nothing new, except the conditions in the Arctic are extremely extreme. No one is surprised when I say that. Conditions in the Arctic are harsh or extreme, harsher than any other place on the Earth, under, on, and above the sea. Temporal and spatial variations, coupled with limited observations, make it extremely difficult to predict and operate. You have an area where you have sea, ice, land, wind, water runoff, air temperature, sea spray, and icing conditions, and extended daylight duration. Challenges in any one of these variables affect navigation, breaking through ice, acoustic modeling, and atmospheric propagation. Polar lows in the north are similar to hurricanes in the mid and low lats, except polar lows develop really quick and move really fast. Operations can further be compounded by the lack of accurate navigation charts. Keys to addressing challenges in the Arctic and predicting the Arctic environment is increasing observations and improving modeling. Models are improving. Research and refinement is continuing through considered effort with the Naval Research Lab and Naval Postgraduate School. And later this year, the U.S. Navy will put into operations at Fleet Numerical Meteorology and Oceanography Center in Monterey, the Navy's first iteration of the Earth Systems Prediction Capability, known as ESPC. ESPC is a national effort to develop and deliver a fully coupled air, ocean, ice, and land model. Over the next 3 years, we'll continue to develop with our partners at NRL, Naval Research Labs in Monterey and Stennis, increased two-way coupling, and improved resolution and model scale, all in an effort to know more truth about the condition in which our Navy and our coalition partners operate. And that specifically includes the Arctic. As good as the models can be, our operational predictive capability will be extremely limited until observations increase. Let me put this in perspective. The current amount of observations that we have in the Arctic are similar to the amount of observations we had over the continental U.S. and in the Atlantic during World War I. We're operating in the blind. Models are great, but they need the input. They need the input of the observations. And in the Arctic, traditional sensors that provide the bulk of observations in the mid and low lats just won't work. Things like geostationary satellites that provide us the environmental observations, gliders, Argo floats. They don't provide the access and persistency required of the Arctic Ocean. We must demand an increase in observational data, creative solutions adapted for the environment, under, on, and above the sea, and integrated data from an increasingly wide variety of observation systems and networks. We must think differently about how we observe and predict in the Arctic. These observations will not only improve the initial conditions of the model, but will also improve our understanding of long-term data patterns and climatology that General O'Shaughnessy spoke of. Improving predictive capability is great, but we need feedback. Operating is key. Validation in the environment is a key step to high-velocity learning and outcomes. We need our forces to focus on the capability and provide feedback. This is why exercises such as Arctic Edge, ICEX, Trident Juncture, and Arctic Exercise, coupled with leveraging the Arctic Research Commission and the Arctic Council Agreement on enhancing international Arctic scientific cooperation, will help us close the gap on where we are with predictive capability and where we need to be. So let me wrap it up and echo a comment that was made by all three gentlemen this morning, and that's the partnerships and the call for help. When it comes to maritime domain awareness, and in particular the characterization and prediction of the environment from the bottom of the ocean to the stars, we can't and shouldn't go alone. Collaboration is key, and the lead for us is the U.S. National and Naval Ice Center, a tri-agency organization outfitted right here in D.C. and Suitland, Maryland. It's led by the Navy and provides global and tactical ice and snow products and ice forecasting. Additionally, Naval Ice Center leads a number of international agreements. One in particular is U.S. agency Arctic Buoy Program, which continues to deliver results. We must collaborate and work together. Resources and access are limited. We can't go it alone. You can see it by the joint panel here. Multi-coalition, multi-service. I think we all can look at each other and know we need our battle buddies and our swim buddies on our right and our left. And remember, the Arctic is selective, slow at recognition of effort and aptitude, but fast in sinking the unfit. Thank you.
So far, we've gotten a broad palette of all of the current issues, all the activities and concerns that we might have in the Arctic. And now is an opportunity for the lightning round for each of you to run for the microphones or raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll get you a microphone. And I will start off as you're lining up with first question. General O'Shaughnessy, thanks for your comments. You raised the issue of national security, which we've been reading in the press and open sources. There are remarks about the report indicating we might have ballistic missile submarines in the Arctic soon. What are your concerns with that kind of activity or behavior, sir?
Yeah, thanks. And one, I would say, just for clarity, you know, a lot of great discussion on cooperation, and I want to make sure that we are, in fact, focusing on cooperation. But we have to be clear-eyed, right? We can't just have cooperation blindly. We have to be clear-eyed about the environment we find ourselves in. And to that point, from our perspective of Northcom and NORAD, we're all about defending the U.S. and on the NORAD side, defending the U.S. and Canada. And so we look at it from that lens, and we look at it to make sure that we never find ourselves in a position we are not able to defend. And so all of the things that we see developing, in this case you mentioned China's activity as was reported in the OSD report. We see the Shuilong and the otherwise known as Snow Dragon and the activity that clearly is an indication of what's to come from China. We see China potentially doing coercive economics with countries in the near Arctic, or in the Arctic as they declare themselves a near Arctic member. And that is absolutely concerning us. And so I think you'll see from the national perspective that we are truly looking at this with clear eyes to, one, cooperate where we can, but in areas where we need to be prepared to defend our nation, and we want to make sure that we are not late to need with that capability and capacity. And so the work that we're doing with our partners within the service, with our Canadian partners, is clearly designed to make sure we maintain that competitive advantage and that we allow the enforcement of the rules-based international order as required, like we do all the way around the globe.
Thank you, sir. Question? Commissioner Hutchinson, I had the pleasure of attending the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, as did you. I was wondering if you could give us a comment on your observations of the relationships and the discussions, specific discussions with our counterparts from Russia and some of the others.
Yeah, sure. I've already made the point that cooperation in the Arctic remains very strong, at least in some channels, and Coast Guard Forum is absolutely among those. I think the recent discussions affirm some of the fundamentals of what the Coast Guard Forum is about. It's meant to be practical, it's meant to be operational. We work together, we actually do live exercise together, and as interest in the Arctic increases in every corner, in every sphere, in every capital, we want to ensure that the operators continue to work together and exercise together. We don't want that function to kind of get, for lack of a better word, bureaucratized. And I think that all the Coast Guard representatives that were there, Russians included, are very, very keen to see that continue. If you sort of extrapolate from some of the comments about the level of observation, the harsh judgments that the Arctic renders mercilessly and quickly, it goes back to the point about humility. The operators know they've got to work together, learn from each other, and it's a very tight-knit group and tight conversation, even though there are certainly points of disagreement sort of outside of that operational discussion. The Russians would like to see the LiveX take on more of a constabulary or even quasi-military role. That's not the purpose of the Coast Guard Forum, so we keep it very much in the civilian response space, and that's going extremely well.
Question?
Thanks very much. My name is Leonard Pecor. I'm with a company called Genoa Design. And first of all, I'd like to say thank you to all the panelists. I think it's a real privilege for us to hear your thoughts so directly like this. My question is primarily to Commissioner Hutchinson, of course, being a Canadian, but I'd invite all the panelists to comment. You mentioned the Indigenous people of our North, and they have a unique relationship with the land and the sea, unique compared to many parts of the world. So I'm curious, do you think they need our support? And if they do, how can we give it? And does this reconcile with the international cooperation that we're doing in the North?
Leonard, man, that's kind of a tough question. First, let me plug Leonard's company, Genoa. Look it up. They're absolutely essential partners to us in 3D modeling, and they are evidence that domestic shipbuilding has far-reaching economic benefits. Just if any of you were questioning that. Do the Inuit need our support? I think we have to recognize that since the 1960s in Canada, the Inuit way of life has changed in a really profound way. And with climate change, it continues to evolve almost out from under their feet, in a sense, right? For centuries, they've looked at their back doors and they've seen nothing but but frozen landscape. And you can talk to people, there are living memories of people whose parents or grandparents have traveled 800 or 1,000 kilometers over the ice as if they were just going from, what'd you say, from Washington to Baltimore? Like, it was very much a part of their ability and perspective. I might not cast it as a dependent relationship. They need our support. In fact, it probably still remains the opposite, that we need their support, their traditional knowledge, their understanding. But there is lots of space for an improved partnership and improved way forward. How that fits with the rules-based international order, I think, is the most interesting part of the question. Inuit perspectives on the ice, their lifestyle, which doesn't differentiate between land and ice, that has potential for influencing the rules-based international order, and Canada has developed over the last 3 decades or so some unique legal ideas around traditional title, ancient title, things like that. Will that influence the rules-based international order? I wouldn't rule it out, but those are ideas that take a long time to take root, and we'll see what happens. But certainly they're going to change the Canadian legal landscape, and we talk more and more about co-management, co-development, cooperation as having a depth that, just a few short years ago, we just talked about consultation. Here's my plan. Do you hate it? Now I do it. We're not in that sphere anymore at all. So I hope that got at what you're asking.
If I might comment, I'll stay away from the legal aspect of it, but I will think you really highlight something that I think we should be cognizant of, and that's the common challenges that we face. And so we certainly see it from our perspective of a close relationship. I'll use the Alaska as an example for us in the work that we're doing with AFN, and Julie Kika, the president of AFN, and the ties to the various history of 10,000 years of experience of operating in this environment, and how we can use that whilst at the same time providing perhaps some answers to their challenges. And as was mentioned by Dan about his trip up to Barrow, we had a similar experience up there of how, as we were arriving there, they had just harvested a whale, and how as they bring it in, talking to the ship captain, and how the whole village comes out. And the village comes out, and they all help in the harvest, right? And they all share in the harvest. And so to me, that perspective that they bring of this, getting after things together, sharing the goodness as well, is something that we can all learn from. And our work with the Alaska Federation Natives in Alaska is trying to bring that together. We host symposiums. They are a big part of the symposiums that we host, and it goes towards that collaboration and getting after common challenges.
I would also say as we did the what next up in the Arctic, most ports have an area maritime security committee that makes sure that everyone's focused on what's important to the collaborative group. We formed a similar thing for the Arctic, and it was 1/3 Alaskan Natives, 1/3 industry, and 1/3 elected officials and public officials to figure out the what next for them, because the world's coming to them. When there's less ice and a small boat shows up from a pocket cruise liner that's got 500 people, and they all come ashore in Barrow that they didn't know was coming, the world's coming to them. And what's important to them, and let's make sure we're focused on those things.
Yeah, let me just, I'll echo the Admiral's comment here. I think it's both, right? They need us, specifically what the Admiral talks about, to be able to protect their way of life. But from my perspective, we need them, I think, more. Right? I need to be able to tap into that local knowledge, that local forecasting, understanding of water runoff. I need to understand how the ice moves, how the atmosphere works up there. It's very, very different. The Navy's got 243 years of experience operating in the mid and low lats. We have very little experience operating on and above the sea in the Arctic. So leveraging that indigenous people's knowledge and understanding of how the environment works up there is critical for us.
Question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Patrick Tucker with Defense One. So, General O'Shaughnessy, just a quick sort of two-parter. First, the new China Power Report does mention potential economic cooperation in the Arctic between China and Russia, but it touches on it very vaguely. I wonder if you could is there something very specific that you're seeing in terms of Chinese and Russian economic cooperation in the Arctic that's giving you pause? And I also wonder if you might elaborate a little bit on the accelerated training and particularly the technology acquisition that's relevant to the Arctic beyond just the vessel acquisition. So, thanks.
Could you repeat the last part? I couldn't.
If you could elaborate on the training and also the technology acquisition beyond just the vessels.
Yeah, sure. Great. So I'll take them back to front. So with respect to the last part, as I mentioned, we are the DoD designated advocate for Arctic capabilities, and as such, we do work with all these services for that capability. And I think what we found in the past is we've often just taken the equipment that we have and then seeing how we can apply that, in this case, to the Arctic. And that doesn't always fare well, right? And so clearly, as we see the operation of the Harry S. Truman and the lessons learned from that, as we look at the future acquisition within the Navy, we have put that demand signal there as part of the formal requirements process to make sure we have the ability to operate within the Arctic environment, not only with the Navy as our close partner with them, but also amongst the other services as well. And so we are putting that requirements out there to drive the services to be able to operate in that environment. In the short term, the exercise we mentioned, no pushback from the services. In fact, eager participation driven by their senior leadership to drive that participation that was mentioned, Arctic Edge and those types of exercises. Now, with respect to the question on Russia and China, I mean, to some degree, there's a natural expectation that Russia, given the GDP based on the Arctic, given their geography, I mean, they're going to be obviously very involved in this. If we look at China, not particularly unusual that as they have a global perspective that they would have some interaction there. It's just a question of are we ensuring that we're not doing things not in accordance with the rules-based international order we talked about, that we're not using coercive economics, for example, with a country like Greenland, and making sure that all that is being done in the Arctic, just like we do all over the world, is done in accordance with international norms.
Thank you.
Yeah, over here.
Question.
Okay, yeah, hi. Cal Biesecker, Defense Daily. First to General O'Shaughnessy, you mentioned the Arctic Working Group. I'm not sure what that is and that you've reinvigorated that. So what is that group and how has it been reinvigorated? And then I have a question for Admiral Abel.
Yeah, thanks for letting me highlight that. So the Arctic Capability Working Group is an opportunity for us at Northcom to lead the Department of Defense in defining and ultimately putting the requirements out for all the services to fill. It's a group that's been in place for some period of time, but just hadn't really had the teeth in it that has driven the services to be able to respond. Given the dynamic that we discussed, clearly it's time for us as Northcom to increase our role in that as a DoD advocate as defined by the Unified Command Plan. And so we've just increased the participation within our headquarters. Like as mentioned, I take the chair of that myself. What does that do? It just drives it now to INDOPACOM, to STRATCOM, to EUCOM, to a higher level within those commands as well, and allows us to make sure that we have their input, not just us as Northcom, but all of the combatant commands that have a play in this and are able to have a kind of a collation of all of the requirements that we have to operate in the Arctic, and then we can push them to the OSD and the Joint Staff in a collaborative, in a coordinated manner. So really it's about articulating the requirements not just of Northcom, but of the Department of Defense in a unified approach to allow a little bit more focused attention on it.
All right, thank you. And Admiral Abel, the Arctic Outlook talked about the lines of effort, and the first one being getting the enhanced capabilities there, and the first part of that is the Polar Security Cutter. But it talks about a lot of other things too, autonomous vehicles and what have you. So what's next? I know you're just getting started with the Polar Security Cutter, but does the Coast Guard have any plans for how it's thinking about what the other needs it has in the Arctic? And also it talks about the needs to close communications gaps, which I know is difficult up there. And General O'Shaughnessy mentioned the use of MUOS I don't know if that's something the Coast Guard can also take advantage for its communications needs up there, but if you could address again sort of the technology needs or other needs going forward beyond the polar security cutter and that communications gap.
Gotcha. Well, first of all, we've got to get between now and when the polar security cutter shows up. Up to now, our presence has been mobile and adaptive. Arctic Shield is where we push forces up there. Usually two H-60 helicopters, C-130s go up to the North Slope, and we'll put a major cutter up there as well. So some of the search and rescue can be cutter-based, some is shore-based. In the past, when I went up to Alaska, I said, how much search and rescue do you do in the Arctic? And they say, we don't. It's all at the Aleutians and in the southeast. This last year, Arctic Shield, 20 search and rescue cases and saved and assisted 35 lives. So thinner ice, going further offshore. The walruses and whales aren't coming as close. They're going further offshore. So the risk is going higher and higher. And these are folks that traditionally don't go that far offshore. So being able to move where the business goes. One of the summers I was up there was when Shell drilled. All the activities were in the Chukchi that year. So all the cutters were in the Chukchi. Next was Crystal Serenity coming, so we pushed to where that would be. So the nice part about being afloat is you can move with the business. As far as capabilities, particularly communications, we're working with DoD on that. As members of the military, we plug and play with their communication systems. We're making sure that our requirements are communicated to Northcom so that they build into their systems the abilities to communicate at the highest latitudes at both ends of the world, because we operate in the Antarctic as well with treaty enforcement and as well as breaking out McMurdo for the rebuild that's going on down there as well. So we've got comms concerns on both ends of the globe.
All right, thank you.
Two more questions. Yes, sir.
I'm Jeremy Palmer from Harris Corporation, and again, thank you all for joining us this morning, and thank you for your service. I'd like to turn to the topic of innovation, as one of the panelists had mentioned earlier. Clearly, we are behind our great power competitors in terms of infrastructure, men and material, and icebreakers in particularly at this point. However, this is not a unique situation if we consider how many times throughout our nation's history that we've been in a position of significant overmatch relative to our competitors. If we think back to the Cold War, for example, in Europe. And I would remind you that this perhaps was also the genesis of the second and third offset strategies that we in the DoD have applied for so many decades. And that involved the development of precision guided munitions, for example, and also most recently robotics and autonomy. So my question for you is this. We in the S&T community are being asked to brainstorm about how we can catch up rapidly and perhaps even overtake or leapfrog our peer competitors in the Arctic. And one of the ideas is leveraging the advances in autonomous systems, unmanned systems in the Arctic as a means of projecting power from a remote place down in the lower 48. Where are you right now on the buildup of autonomous systems in the Arctic?
Let me jump on that one first. As the leader of unmanned systems in the Navy, we operate a fleet of about 180 unmanned systems, all the way from 6,000 meters up to surface gliders, Slocum gliders from Teledyne. And it is an absolute key aspect of us being able to operate in the Arctic and observe in the Arctic. So for the S&T community, I tell you that we need really three things. And the most important is persistency, right? One of the limiting factors for unmanned vehicles right now is battery technology, right? And the cost of those batteries. So low cost, persistent sensors that can operate really probably in the upper 200 or 300 meters where the runoff from the ice and the snowpack from the land are affecting that acoustic signature are critical. And you listen to the CNO and our Navy leadership, unmanned systems is a force multiplier for the future. And in my business, more so when it comes to being able to put sensors up there with our limited joint and coalition partners together to be able to observe and then share that data. So low cost, persistent sensors are critical.
So I'll just add that Department of Homeland Security, you know, our mother organization, they're in space. We had 2 CubeSats that we launched up at the pole to try to increase coverage for comms gaps we have up there. So working that. A couple years ago, the Healy, she took a UAV on her, and we did some testing with a thermal dummy, threw it out there, and we saw if we could use persistent surveillance from a UAS to then detect and find someone in the water, and then the H-60 would then deploy to take the search out of search and rescue. AIS technology, when I was up there, we had a barge that just as it was starting to ice in, it got caught in the ice. We deployed an AIS transmitter on it. We were able to watch where it was all winter long, make sure it didn't pose a hazard to anyone, and then when spring came, we were able to get out there and then rally that thing up and get it tied ashore. So we're looking, and finally I would say, shame on us if we rebuild the Polar Sea or the Polar Star from the 1970s. This Polar Security Cutter is a joint Coast Guard Navy acquisition to meet our national needs. It better have some pretty cool stuff.
Yeah, I'd highlight on that as well. And to me, there's, using the semantics that General Goldfein, our Chief Staff of the Air Force, likes to use, is that, to me, it's got to be new old, and it's got to be new new. And what I mean by that is some of the things we have to do in the here and the now is we're going to have to put new technology into old ways of doing business, but that's not going to get us to where we need to go. At some point, we need to put new new. We need to put new innovative thoughts and new innovative technology and bring those together and do things in different ways than we've done it in the past. And so that is the exciting part, I think, as we go forward. And why would you not want to bring the human element out of it in an unmanned, UAS type of way, given the harsh conditions we are? That clearly would be a way to get after this in ways that you could have that persistence that is so hard when you do bring the human element into it. Thank you.
Last question.
Great. Hi, I'm Melody Schreiber. I'm from Arctic Today. One thing that I noticed in both the Coast Guard and the Navy Arctic strategies was the absence of the phrase climate change. I did notice a description of physical environmental changes, but how does the limitations imposed on using the word climate change affect strategy, like big term thinking about how to mitigate or address the effects in the Arctic?
The Coast Guard philosophy is the fact it's undeniable conditions are changing up there. I mean, you talk to the Alaskan natives and they'll tell you this is not the way it was when I was a child. How we got here, where we're going, I leave to the scientists and the meteorologists to figure that out. But change has happened and change is happening, and we need to adapt to that change. So I'm not going to get into the science behind it, but I'm into the so what and what next, which is where the U.S. Coast Guard needs to be, is what are we going to do about it, and how are we going to operate there, and how are we going to do what our nation needs at the far extreme latitudes.
Thanks, Admiral. Yeah, and so undeniable. I gave you the numbers earlier on the changes of sea ice, and so the Navy's been on this path for about 10 years. We started with Task Force Climate Change, and the Navy identified this 10 years ago that climate change is happening. And I'll echo your comments, Admiral. So what are we going to do about it? We've embedded our understanding of the Arctic and the changes that are happening in the processes throughout the past 10 years, and it really has culminated. It built for the first 2014 roadmap, or the 2009 roadmap, 2014, and then really has been solidified in Navy culture with the current strategy. So what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do when we know we're going to have to operate up there and protect the homeland, been able to keep our joint and coalition forces safe? So I don't necessarily wouldn't read into the fact that climate change is not in the strategy. I think it's understood and agreed by all Navy leadership that it's happening, and so the strategy lays a path going forward of what are we going to do about it.
I misspoke. One more question. Did we miss anything, General?
No, I just thank everyone for your time today, because this, from my perspective, is such a critically important topic, and the Arctic is something that needs to be on the forefront of our discussions. So thank you.
Commissioner?
I think we've covered the waterfront, so to speak. I hope the U.S. Coast Guard will continue to play the role that it has in advocating international rules-based order, particularly in the Arctic. They can always count on a very strong friend and partner in the Canadian Coast Guard on that front. The climate change question, let's face it, folks, we're into climate adaptation, and that's a southern issue, that's a Miami issue, that's a Chesapeake Bay issue, that's a Halifax, Nova Scotia issue, and that's an Arctic issue. So our strategies and our policies are, about slowing climate change, but adaptability is now more and more at the top of our thinking on that front. Thank you all for your interest. Thank you for being here, and I hope you will continue to advocate for Arctic issues.
So, Mike, shame on me if three sailors don't tell a sea story. So I'm going to finish with the world that we now live in. So as the search and rescue coordinator for the Arctic for the United States, had a sailor, the single sailor, solo, going from Canada to Canada across the top, and had a text device, and texted his wife and said, I'm stuck in the ice. God bless a wife when they call, because she could get rid of the boat and the husband at the same time if she didn't call. But she called. She must love him. And said, and we relayed, are you declaring emergency? And he said, no, I'm fine. I just want to tell somebody I'm stuck in the ice. A 47-foot aluminum boat and sailboat. And so we put him on a communication schedule through the spouse with a text device. The next day, I'm in a body of water about the size of an Olympic-sized swimming pool. We said, are you declaring emergency? No, I'm okay. Next day, he said, ice up to the boat, polar bears coming on the boat. I'm beating pots and pans together to keep the polar bears from getting on my boat. Are you declaring an emergency? No, I'm fine. At this point, we decided, yes, he was declaring an emergency, and based on the weather and the conditions. And we had an icebreaker that was only 200 miles away, which is like right in the neighborhood when it comes to the Arctic with the distances you have. So we asked the skipper, can you safely close and not sink him? Because we didn't want a large ship with a big chunk of ice to put it on his deck and sink him. And they closed the target. He was very happy the Coast Guard was there. We got him to Barrow, inspected his vessel. He waited a little longer. And then he finished his tour into your waters, and we handed him over to you, and eventually he made it. That is what's going on. The amount of more blue that in the summertime is on the top of the earth is the size of half the continental United States. That's how much more water is at the top of the earth. You can just imagine what that's going to draw as far as activity. Thanks.
I was going to close with a sea story. And just before I got here, and I'll encourage everybody to go over to the Navy Heritage and History booth, which is outside. And Trident Juncture this past year is the first time we've had an aircraft carrier operating in the high north for an extended period. The last time was Teamwork 92 with our partners in Norway, when then young Ensign Okon, who's in that cruise book at the Heritage booth with much longer hair, had the opportunity to operate up there firsthand. And I understood the harsh Arctic conditions as a deck officer, having the captain look at you going, John, we're a fairly stable cruiser right now, but we can't afford to take this kind of ice accumulation topside. What are we doing about it? So what are we doing about it? It's difficult. It's very hard. And we need everybody's help. And I'll leave you with one last quote from my comments. The amount of observations we take in the Arctic are equivalent to what we took over the continental U.S., what we take over the continental U.S. in the Atlantic during World War I. We're 100 years behind in understanding and observing the conditions in which we know we are going to have to defend the homeland and work with our partners. So what are we going to do about it? Thank you.
Thank you for your attention. It's time for lunch. One more round of applause.